It doesn't take a lot of tomatoes to make a small batch of tomato sauce. As a gardener, I'm constantly pulling tomatoes off my plants, and oftentimes I only pull 5 to 10 off my plants at once. If you got just 5 tomatoes, you can easily make a small batch of tomato sauce in just a short stint in the kitchen. This jar of sauce went from fresh tomatoes to cooked sauce in way less than 30 minutes, even though I had to man the camera before and throughout the cooking process. Keep in mind, I am not a food blogger. I don't do cooking videos. This one just needs to be made because it's so relevant to the channel. I even asked my 13-year-old son which sauce he preferred. The fancy sauce we occasionally buy at the store, the super fancy tomato jam that my wife makes every year, or this basic sauce that I make on a whim. He chose this version. Kids that like spaghetti don't lie, apparently. First of all, if you have about 5 to 10 small Roma tomatoes, then you've got enough to make a small jar of sauce. These don't have to come from the garden. You could literally just buy the cheap Romas at the grocery store. These 5 tomatoes netted me about 10 ounces of sauce, which is a great amount for cooking. Maybe not quite enough for some recipes out there, but plenty for general use in the kitchen on any given day. Obviously, wash your tomatoes first, and then put a pot of salted water on to boil. While the water is warming, also place a small bowl of ice water next to the pot for blanching. That sounds like a fancy term, but seriously, it's not a fancy technique. When blanching tomatoes, the key to doing it right is to only do 1 or 2 tomatoes at a time. Don't try and blanch 10 tomatoes at once. It just doesn't work as well. While the water is coming to boil, I take a sharp knife and I cut a cross into the base of the tomato on the opposite end from the stem. Sometimes I'll cut a small circle around the stem and remove it before blanching, but you can just as easily do this afterwards. The cross is the important part. With my crosses cut, I place 1 single tomato into the boiling water at a time, and I leave it there for between 10 to 15 seconds. After that, I lift it out and drop it into the ice water. 10 seconds results in a tomato that is slightly harder to peel, but much less cooked. A 15-second dip is much easier to peel, but it's starting to get cooked in the outer pulp areas. Your choice how long to steep. Maybe just count to 10 to 13 and split the difference. So for 5 tomatoes, all the tomatoes are easily blanched in less than 90 seconds. We're talking 3 minutes for 10 tomatoes. That's not that big of a deal. I pull my blanched tomatoes out of the water, put them onto paper towels so that they can dry a little bit, and then I start peeling back the skins with my fingers, one at a time. You could use a knife to do this, but you don't need one if you don't want to use one. I never do. God gave me fingers, that's what I use. Each tomato can easily be peeled in about 30 seconds or less, and then the stem core can easily be cut out if you haven't done so already. There's no rocket science. Just cut in a circle and yank it out. In all honesty, you don't need to peel or core the stem point at all, but the texture of the sauce is better with these parts of the tomato removed. So I typically do it unless I'm really in a rush. Once the blanched tomato is processed, I just make 2 to 3 cuts in it, depending on how large each tomato is, and I throw it all into an oiled pan, and I saute it slowly for 10 minutes or so. In the pan of tomatoes, I add salt, pepper, chopped garlic every single time, and then I'll add any seasoning that I like. You could use any seasoning that you like. Thyme, oregano, basil, these are always great options, but in this case, I just added a good bit of summer savory. I don't usually measure my flavoring spices. You don't have to either. Just put a little in, taste it. If you think it needs more, add a little bit more. In this case, I used about 2 teaspoons worth of savory, but I always taste. That's the one thing I've learned from all of those cooking shows. It works. During the sauteing process, I plug in my immersion blender. You might not have one. It's something that I wouldn't ever give up in my kitchen. It's incredibly useful. I use that blender to quickly blend the sauce in the pan. I don't even have to take it out of the pan. I blend it in the pan a little bit, a few times every now and then throughout that 10-minute saute. Now, I do prefer my sauce to have some small chunks in it, so I never use the food processor or a countertop blender or anything else. One of the other perks of doing it this way with the immersion blender is that I find it to be way easier to clean that immersion blender than any other type of blender. I like cleaning, so I try my best to do things in the least messy way possible. Most of the time, of course. After you saute the sauce for a while, I just pour my sauce into a jar through a canning funnel because we own one, Or you could just use it as is in the same pan to cook right into. Now, for the charred flavor, if you want it, you could put a lid on the sauce in the pan after it has cooked for a while. Turn that heat up as high as it goes for a couple minutes to get a small caramelization on the lower layer of the sauce. Just be sure to not keep the heat on for too high for too long, otherwise that lower layer will burn. After a bit of time has passed, pull it off the heat, stir it together well. This technique isn't the same by a long shot as roasting your tomatoes before making the sauce, but it does add a new layer of flavor to the mix that you don't get using only the gentle saute method. For my family, that basic saute method satisfies everyone just fine, so I don't typically go the extra mile unless I really want to go all out for something special. For what it's worth, this simple tomato sauce recipe is what I use if I plan on using the tomatoes for a meal today or any other time this week. You could freeze the stuff in baggies, but I never do. In our home, we either cook to use now or we cook for canning and long-term storage. Canning those tomatoes is out of the scope of this video, so I'm not going to touch on that subject any further. Obviously, you could embellish the recipe by adding peppers or onions or anything else, but I like to keep the sauce basic and add other ingredients to the sauce when I go to use it. It's a preferential thing. Just do whatever you think is best. The most important point to keep in mind, though, is that you don't need many tomatoes to make a sauce, nor do you need much time or many ingredients. I said that this sauce was made in way less than 30 minutes. This sauce was probably made in less than 15 minutes. It all depends on how long you want to saute your tomatoes. Even if you don't have an immersion blender, the sauce is still going to come together just by sauteing. Maybe a pinch longer, and of course you'll have to break up those tomatoes while they cook with a spoon, but it still works. Now, I've been growing tomatoes for the better part of a decade, and this is how I process a ton of them. And I rarely have to buy them anymore, even during the winter. If you'd like to learn the basics of growing them yourself, then see my videos linked in the description below, or perhaps this video, which is sitting on your screen right now. It's way easier to grow these things than most people realize.